My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life I've been the kind of person people don't worry about remembering. I was the quiet one in the room, the son who did what was needed without asking to be seen, the family member whose presence was noticed more by absence than contribution, or at least that's how it felt. If you asked people back then to describe me, they might have said I was dependable but unremarkable, safe, background noise. Even in my own family, I was often spoken about in terms of limitations rather than potential. My mother once said something to me, casually, almost without thinking, that stayed longer than she ever intended. She called me useless, not in anger, not even in a fight. Just as a fact, she believed everyone already knew. This story is sometimes summarized online as, "My mom called me useless, but I saved the family business." That's technically true, but it's also incomplete. Because this isn't a story about proving someone wrong in a dramatic way, or about revenge, or even about winning. It's about what happens when someone is underestimated for so long that silence becomes their native language, and how that silence, when chosen deliberately, can change the balance of an entire family. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through a period of my life where very little seemed to be happening on the surface. No shouting matches, no big declarations, no heroic moments anyone could point to at the time. Yet underneath that calm exterior, something was shifting, slowly, methodically, and without anyone noticing until it was already too late to undo. This is a story about emotional justice, not emotional payoff. There's no villain here, no monster to defeat, just ordinary people, good intentions mixed with blind spots, and one person who learned to stop explaining himself. It's also about responsibility, what it means to carry weight quietly when everyone assumes you're incapable of lifting anything at all. You might recognize parts of yourself in this. Maybe you've been the one people overlook. Maybe you've learned to stay quiet because speaking never seemed to help. Or maybe you've been on the other side, too busy, too confident, too certain about who someone was to notice who they were becoming. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't dramatize conversations or inflate my role. What I'll give you instead is honesty about the moments that cut, the choices that mattered, and the calm resolve that grew where anger never did. Because in the end, the one everyone underestimated became the last person our family could rely on, and not because I demanded that role, but because I accepted it when no one else could. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever realized your value only after everyone else stopped looking for it? To my family, I was predictable. Not in a comforting way, more in the way furniture is predictable. Always there, rarely discussed, only noticed when something needed to be carried, fixed, or quietly handled. I don't think anyone consciously decided this was my role. It just settled around me over time, like dust that no one bothers to wipe because it doesn't seem to bother anyone. In our family business, I didn't have a title people remembered. Officially, I was an operations assistant. Unofficially, I was the person who filled gaps. If paperwork piled up, it landed on my desk. If a supplier needed a follow-up call that no one had time for, I made it. If a long-time employee needed someone to listen without judgment, they found their way to me. None of it looked impressive from the outside. None of it looked like leadership. At family gatherings, conversations flowed around me. My older brother talked about growth and expansion. My cousins debated ideas they'd heard on podcasts. My mother listened, nodded, and offered opinions that carried weight. When I spoke, people were polite. They smiled. Then the conversation moved on, smoother without my interruption. I wasn't angry about it. That's important to understand. I didn't feel wronged or abused. I felt categorized, as if somewhere early on a decision had been made about my capacity, and everything after that simply confirmed it. When you live inside that kind of expectation long enough, you stop testing its edges. My mother's view of me shaped the rest. She wasn't cruel. She was practical. She valued results that could be pointed to, named, and praised publicly. She believed competence should announce itself. Since I didn't, she assumed it wasn't there. I remember how she'd introduce me to others. "This is Daniel. He helps out at the office. It does not work in operations. It does not handle logistics. Just helps out." As if my presence was temporary, interchangeable. At work, that perception filtered down. Senior managers didn't challenge me, but they didn't consult me either. Decisions were made in meetings I wasn't invited to, then passed down to me to implement quietly. I learned early that asking why only slowed things down, so I focused on how. What people mistook for passivity was actually pattern recognition. I noticed which suppliers always paid late, which contracts were renewed without being read, which employees quietly held everything together while others took credit. I noticed because no one was watching me notice. But to them, I was still safe. Safe to overlook. Safe to assign tasks to. Safe to underestimate. There's a strange loneliness in being trusted with responsibility, but not with respect. You're relied on, but never leaned on. Needed, but never acknowledged as necessary. Over time, you learn not to expect acknowledgement. You learn to measure yourself internally instead. The comment my mother made, that word, useless, didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of that quiet classification. To her, I wasn't failing. I simply wasn't registering. And in a world where value is measured by noise, silence reads as absence. Still, I stayed. I showed up every day. Not because I hoped things would change, but because leaving felt like admitting she was right. And staying, quietly doing the work no one wanted to do, felt like a form of integrity, even if no one else recognized it as such. At that point in my life, I didn't think of myself as underestimated. I thought of myself as realistic. I believed my role was to support, not lead, to stabilize, not steer. That belief kept the peace. It kept the business running, and it kept me invisible. What I didn't know then was that invisibility has its own kind of power, if you stop trying to escape it. The first time my mother said it, I didn't react. That's the truth people find hardest to believe. There was no sharp intake of breath, no sting that made my chest tighten. Just a brief pause in my hands as I sorted through invoices, and then I kept going. We were in her office late one evening. The building was quiet in that end-of-day way, when the fluorescent lights feel harsher because there's no conversation to soften them. She was frustrated, not with me, but with the numbers. A delayed shipment, a missed projection. One of those weeks where nothing collapses, but nothing quite works either. She rubbed her temples and sighed. "I don't know why I even expect help sometimes," she said, not looking at me. "You're useless in situations like this." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't emphasize the word. It was delivered with the same tone someone might use to say the printer was out of ink. A statement of condition, not accusation. I remember nodding. Or maybe I didn't. What I remember clearly is how quickly my mind moved to minimize it. She's tired. She didn't mean it personally. This isn't the moment to make it about you. Those thoughts arrived automatically, well practiced after years of deflecting attention away from myself. She moved on immediately, continuing to talk through the problem as if nothing had happened. And in a way, nothing had, externally. The numbers still need to be reconciled. The supplier still needed a call. The evening still needed to end. But internally, something had been recorded. Not anger, not resentment, just data. That's how it felt. A line added to a mental ledger. Not to be used later, not stored for revenge, just acknowledged. Like noticing a hairline crack in a wall you've walked past every day without looking closely. What made it a small cut wasn't the word itself. It was the ease with which it was said. The confidence behind it. The assumption that it was both accurate and harmless. That it wouldn't need explanation or repair. No one else was there. No one defended me, but no one had the chance to. And that mattered, because it told me something important. This wasn't a public opinion. It was a private certainty. Over the next few days, nothing changed. My mother was cordial, efficient. She asked me to handle tasks the same way she always had. If there was guilt, it never surfaced. And I didn't bring it up. Not because I was afraid, but because I was curious. I wanted to see whether the comment was an anomaly or a pattern, so I watched more closely. I noticed how often my contributions were framed as help rather than responsibility. How solutions I quietly implemented were later discussed as if they had emerged on their own. How mistakes in areas I didn't control were still absorbed into my perceived competence. I also noticed something else, how comfortable everyone was with my silence. My lack of response didn't make things awkward. It made them easier. No recalibration required. No emotional labor demanded. That's when I understood something subtle but important. Silence wasn't just my habit. It was part of the system. It allowed others to move faster, feel smarter, and remain unchallenged. And in return, I was allowed to stay. The cut didn't bleed. It didn't ache. It just existed. And because it was small, it was easy to ignore. But small cuts have a way of reopening when pressure is applied. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. Those words spoken in frustration shouldn't be given weight. That my value didn't need to be validated externally. All of that was true. But it was also incomplete. Because the first time someone tells you who they think you are, you're given a choice. You can correct them, or you can listen. I chose to listen. After that evening, nothing dramatic followed. There was no escalation, no apology, no repeat of the exact word. And that was almost worse, because it allowed me to treat it as a one-time lapse. A bad moment. An unfiltered thought that slipped out and wouldn't return. Except it did, just in different forms. It showed up in tone before language, in the way my suggestions were acknowledged with a nod and then quietly bypassed, in how decisions were framed as already settled, even when I had provided the data that should have shaped them, in how my workload increased without any corresponding increase in authority or trust. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It blends in. It disguises itself as efficiency, as hierarchy, as that's just how things work. And because I had already learned not to expect recognition, it didn't feel like something new. It felt familiar. So I adjusted. I told myself my mother's generation valued different things, that she trusted charisma over consistency, that she needed people who could speak confidently in rooms full of investors, not someone who preferred to sit quietly with spreadsheets and contracts. These explanations weren't lies. They were reasonable. They also made it easier to stay silent. At work, my role expanded in all the ways that don't get documented. I became the person who remembered the details no one else wanted to track. I knew which employees were burning out long before they said anything. I knew which systems would fail if pushed too hard. I knew because people talked to me when they didn't feel the need to perform. But when meetings happened, those insights stayed with me. Not because I was excluded, sometimes I was invited, but because the space didn't reward caution. It rewarded confidence. And I had learned that speaking carefully often sounded like uncertainty to people who were listening for certainty. At home, the dynamic was similar. Family conversations had an unspoken rhythm. Certain voices led. Certain opinions carried weight. Mine filled the gaps when something needed to be done, not when something needed to be decided. When relatives joked about me being the quiet one, I smiled. When someone asked if I planned to do more someday, I answered neutrally. I wasn't hiding hurt. I was avoiding friction. And over time, avoidance became a habit. What surprised me most was how easy it was to normalize all of it. Humans are adaptable that way. We build stories that allow us to function in imperfect systems. I told myself I preferred being behind the scenes, that I didn't want pressure or visibility, that recognition would complicate things. And in many ways, that was true. I didn't crave the spotlight. I didn't want authority for its own sake. But there's a difference between choosing invisibility and having it assigned to you. I felt that difference most clearly when my work was missing. Once I took a week off. Nothing dramatic, just a planned absence. By the third day, I received messages asking where certain files were, how certain processes worked, and who usually handled specific vendor issues. There was no acknowledgement of dependency, just confusion, as if a piece of machinery had stopped functioning, and no one knew why. When I returned, things settled quickly. No one commented on the disruption. The system absorbed my presence again without reflection, and I let it. That was the pattern. Discomfort would arise in my absence. Relief would follow my return. And then amnesia. I don't say this to paint myself as a martyr. I wasn't suffering. I was stable, functional, respected in small, quiet ways. But I was also being steadily written into a role that left no room for growth. The disrespect wasn't overt enough to challenge, and it wasn't severe enough to justify leaving. It lived in that gray area where endurance feels like maturity, where staying calm feels like strength. And maybe it was, up to a point, because when you normalize being overlooked, you also normalize not being prepared for when things go wrong. You train people to assume you'll always be there, quietly compensating for their blind spots. You become essential in ways that are never formally acknowledged. I didn't see it as a problem then. I saw it as my place. But places, like systems, only work until they're tested. There was a moment, not a single event, but a slow accumulation, when I understood that my role in the family and in the business had already been decided without my input. I wasn't asked if I agreed to it. I wasn't informed explicitly. It simply became clear through repetition. I was the one who would always stay late because I didn't have more important things to do. The one who could be interrupted because my time was considered flexible. The one who could be trusted with execution, but not with vision. Reliable. Useful. Invisible. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. My mother relied on me in practical ways, but not in strategic ones. She trusted me to make sure things didn't fall apart, but not to decide where things should go. When something worked smoothly, it confirmed her belief that the system was fine. When something failed, it reinforced her belief that I wasn't equipped to handle more. And I played along. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The role fit well enough that resisting it felt unnecessary. I didn't argue when decisions were made without me. I didn't insist on credit when processes I built were adopted. I didn't correct assumptions about my ambition. There was comfort in being underestimated. Expectations were low. Mistakes were forgiven more easily. Successes didn't come with scrutiny. I could move freely within the margins. But comfort has a cost. The more I embodied that role, the more it shaped how others interacted with me. New employees learned quickly who had authority and who didn't. Family members followed cues they didn't realize they were taking. Even I began to internalize the limits of what I was supposed to handle. I noticed it in meetings. When complex issues arose, eyes turned toward louder voices. When follow-through was needed, they turned toward me. I was the bridge between ideas and reality, but never the source of either. There was one conversation that clarified everything. A senior consultant had been brought in to review operations. He spent a week observing workflows, interviewing staff, and reviewing documents. On his final day, he presented his findings to leadership. I wasn't in the room for most of it, but afterward, he pulled me aside. "You're holding this place together," he said quietly. "They don't realize it." I thanked him and went back to my desk. That should have felt validating. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something I had been avoiding. Because if I was holding things together and no one knew, that meant the role wasn't temporary. It was structural. At home, the same dynamic played out in subtler ways. Family decisions were discussed over dinner. Conclusions reached before I spoke. My opinions were treated as supportive commentary, not contributions that could change direction. When my mother talked about the future of the business, she spoke in terms of handing it over to those she saw as capable of leading. I was mentioned only in passing, if at all. Not as a candidate, but as a constant, someone who would always be there, regardless of who was in charge. That was when I realized the role I had been assigned wasn't just about work. It was about identity. I was the dependable one, the safe one, the one who wouldn't disrupt things by wanting more. And because I had never challenged that image, it solidified. Still, I didn't feel resentment. I felt clarity. Roles exist because they serve a function. Mine served theirs well. The question I hadn't asked yet was whether it served me, and what would happen if one day I stopped playing it. I didn't know the answer then. I only knew that the role had been defined and that everyone was comfortable with it. Everyone, that is, except me. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no dramatic line crossed, no moment where someone finally went too far. If you had been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. That's what makes it difficult to explain. The day something changed looked exactly like every other day. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because Tuesdays were usually heavy with routine, status checks, reconciliations, follow-ups that existed only because someone had forgotten to follow up the first time. I arrived early, as I often did, and the office was still quiet. That quiet felt different that morning. Not peaceful. Empty. I sat at my desk and opened my notebook, the one I'd been carrying for years. It wasn't sentimental. It was practical. Dates, figures, and notes written quickly and without flourish. A record of things that mattered, even when no one else thought they did. As I flipped through it, I noticed something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. Patterns. Not just in numbers, but in behavior. The same problems are recurring. The same decisions lead to the same complications. The same people are stepping in at the last moment to fix what could have been prevented. I had been compensating for dysfunction without ever naming it as such. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with a strange sense of distance, as if I were suddenly observing the system from outside myself. I saw how my silence wasn't just being misunderstood, it was being used. Not maliciously, but efficiently. Later that morning, my mother called a meeting. Another issue, another delay, another conversation about tightening controls and increasing oversight. I listened, took notes, and nodded at the appropriate moments. When she asked if there were any concerns, the room stayed quiet. I had concerns, specific ones, documented ones, but I didn't speak. That was the moment. Not because I chose silence, but because I understood it. For the first time, I saw that my silence wasn't neutral. It was an active choice, one that maintained the current structure. And if silence could maintain a system, it could also be redirected. After the meeting, I didn't feel the usual pull to resolve things immediately. I didn't rush to smooth over issues or preempt consequences. Instead, I paused. I let problems remain visible a little longer than I normally would. Nothing collapsed. Nothing caught fire. But small discomforts surfaced. Emails went unanswered longer than usual. Questions circulated without clear owners. Minor inefficiencies became noticeable. It wasn't sabotage. It was an absence. That afternoon, I walked home instead of taking my usual route. The extra time gave me space to think, not about how to fix things, but about why I always felt compelled to. I realized that my sense of responsibility had grown in the absence of authority. I had filled a vacuum that no one else had been required to notice. The shift was internal, but it was decisive. I stopped seeing my role as fixed. I stopped assuming my value had to be invisible to be valid. And I stopped believing that endurance was the same thing as loyalty. I didn't plan anything that day. There was no strategy, no timeline, just a quiet acknowledgement. The way things were working depended on me staying exactly where I was. And I wasn't sure I wanted to anymore. When I got home, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. Not a declaration, just an observation. If I step back, what happens next will be honest. That was all. No confrontation followed, no announcement. But from that day on, I was no longer just reacting. I was watching, carefully, patiently, and with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. That's how change began, not with noise, but with attention. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. On the surface, nothing about my behavior looked different. I still arrived early. I still completed my tasks. I still answered questions when asked. But internally, something had shifted from reflex to intention. Before, my quietness had been automatic, a default setting shaped by years of adaptation. Now it was deliberate. I chose when to speak, when to act, and when to let things unfold without my intervention. That distinction mattered more than I expected. The first test came quickly. A supplier dispute surfaced. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to disrupt schedules if mishandled. Normally, I would have stepped in immediately, made the calls, smoothed the issue over before it reached leadership. This time, I waited, not out of spite, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see how the system responded without my early involvement. The issue reached my mother's desk. Voices were raised, not in anger, but in urgency. Meetings were called, solutions were proposed, then revised. Eventually, someone asked me for input. I gave it, calmly, precisely. The solution was the same one I would have implemented days earlier. It worked. No one noticed the difference in timing. They noticed the resolution, not the delay. And that told me something important. My value was being recognized only at the moment it was visible. Everything before that was invisible labor. As weeks passed, I continued this approach. I stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't mine to own. I let responsibilities sit with the roles they officially belonged to. When asked directly, I responded. When ignored, I observed. People began to misinterpret this change. Some assumed I was disengaging. Others thought I was overwhelmed. A few mistook my restraint for uncertainty. No one considered that I was choosing differently, because from their perspective, I had never chosen anything at all. I had simply been. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. With fewer immediate demands, I had more time to look closely at the structure beneath the day-to-day chaos. I reviewed contracts thoroughly, not just for compliance, but for leverage. I traced decision-making paths, noting where authority was assumed rather than assigned. I paid attention to who signed what and who never did. I also listened more carefully. When people believe you're passive, they speak freely around you. They share frustrations, shortcuts, and assumptions. They reveal gaps without realizing it. My mother, in particular, seemed to relax around me. She spoke candidly about pressures she felt, risks she was taking, deals she was unsure about but felt compelled to pursue. She didn't see me as someone who would challenge her, only as someone who would support implementation. And I did, selectively. This wasn't manipulation. I wasn't setting traps or withholding critical information. I was simply aligning my effort with my role, as it had been defined. If I wasn't invited into strategic discussions, I didn't force my way in. If my insight wasn't requested, I didn't volunteer it. The system began to show strain, not because I was undermining it, but because it had been leaning on me without realizing it. Deadlines slipped slightly. Small inefficiencies compounded. Nothing disastrous, but enough to create a low-level tension. People worked harder without working smarter. Meetings grew longer. Decisions became reactive. Through it all, I remained calm, present, available, and that calmed unsettled people. Silence, when expected, is comforting. Silence, when chosen, feels different. It introduces uncertainty. People don't know what it means, so they project. Weakness, detachment, compliance. No one suspected preparation. I wasn't waiting for a dramatic moment. I wasn't hoping for failure. I was letting reality speak for itself, without my constant translation. For the first time, my silence wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about respecting the truth of the system as it was. And the truth was beginning to surface. While the surface of the business continued its familiar rhythm, meetings, emails, minor crises, something else was happening underneath, quietly, methodically, in ways no one thought to watch. When you're underestimated, people don't track your movements. They don't ask why you're staying late or what you're reading. They assume it's more of the same: routine, support, background maintenance. That assumption gave me room. I began by organizing information I already had. Years of notes, emails, contracts, and informal understandings lived in scattered places: my notebook, my inbox, my memory. I centralized them, not to build a case against anyone, but to understand the system in full. I mapped out workflows from beginning to end: who initiated the decisions, who approved them, who executed them, and most importantly, who absorbed the consequences when things went wrong. Patterns emerged quickly. Authority and accountability are rarely aligned. There were contracts signed without full review, renewed out of habit rather than relevance. Vendor relationships are maintained through personal rapport rather than performance. Financial controls that relied more on trust than verification. None of this was illegal or reckless on its own, but together they formed a fragile structure, one that depended heavily on informal corrections. Corrections I had been making quietly for years. I didn't announce my findings. I didn't confront anyone with them. I just documented dates, names, dependencies, not accusations, just facts. At the same time, I invested in learning, not through grand programs or certifications that would draw attention, but through targeted study. I revisited financial regulations relevant to our industry. I read case studies of family-run businesses that had failed, and why. I studied how authority could be transferred without conflict, and how it often wasn't. I paid particular attention to governance, not in theory but in practice. Who held real power when things went wrong? Who could act quickly without consensus? Who was protected by the process and who wasn't? The answers weren't always what people thought. I also strengthened relationships, quietly. Long-term employees trusted me because I had never used their confidence as currency. I continued to listen without an agenda. I learned what motivated them, what worried them, and what they feared losing if leadership changed. They didn't see me as a future leader. They saw me as stable, and stability breeds honesty. Suppliers, too, spoke openly with me. They knew I understood their constraints. They knew I followed through. Over time, small accommodations were offered. Flexibility here, early notice there. Nothing inappropriate, just professional respect. All of this created something I hadn't set out to build, but recognized once it existed. Positional leverage, not power, leverage. Power demands visibility. Leverage works quietly. My mother noticed none of this, not because she was careless, but because she was focused elsewhere, on growth, on pressure from external partners, on maintaining an image of confidence. She assumed I was where I had always been, managing details, absorbing friction. In a way, she was right. I hadn't moved. The ground beneath us had. The most important thing I prepared wasn't a document or a plan. It was a restraint. I practiced not reacting, not correcting immediately, not offering solutions unless asked. This wasn't about withholding help. It was about allowing others to experience the full weight of their decisions. Only then could they understand the system they were operating. There were moments I was tempted to step in, to prevent minor issues from becoming visible, to protect the business from discomfort. But I reminded myself of the sentence I had written weeks earlier. If I step back, what happens next will be honest. Honesty isn't always kind, but it's necessary. By the time anyone sensed that something felt different, they couldn't identify what it was. There was no single change to point to, no clear cause, just a sense that things were more complicated than they used to be. What they never noticed was that I was ready, not to take over, not to confront, but to act, if acting became necessary. And I knew that moment was approaching. The reveal didn't arrive with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no moment where everything suddenly made sense in a cinematic way. It came quietly, the way most truths do when you're finally prepared to see them. I was reviewing a set of documents late one evening, routine on the surface, familiar enough that no one would have questioned why I was still there. They were renewal agreements tied to a long-standing partnership, the kind everyone assumed would roll over automatically, the way they always had. I'd seen versions of these contracts before. I'd even flagged small issues in the past. Clauses that were vague, timelines that were flexible in ways that favored the other side. Each time, the response had been the same. We've always done it this way. They're reliable. Don't complicate things. This time, I read them without that internal filter. Not as support staff, not as the person responsible for implementation, but as someone asking a different question. Who actually holds the risk here? The answer was uncomfortable. Over the years, operational authority had shifted subtly. Not formally, not intentionally, but functionally. Certain commitments were being made based on assumptions rather than enforceable safeguards, and those assumptions relied on one thing above all else: informal corrections happening behind the scenes. Corrections I had been making. I cross-referenced timelines, responsibilities, and escalation clauses. I compared them to internal processes: who was authorized to intervene, who could pause execution, and who could legally renegotiate terms if something went wrong. That's when I saw it. There was a narrow window, one that existed only because of how responsibilities had been distributed, where action could be taken without requiring consensus or approval. Not a loophole, a responsibility gap. Because my role was considered support, certain operational safeguards had been delegated to me by default, not out of trust in my judgment, but out of convenience. Over time, that delegation had accumulated. I wasn't in charge, but I was positioned. The realization didn't make me feel powerful, it made me feel sober. Leverage isn't something you celebrate when you find it, it's something you weigh. Because once you see it, you're responsible for how it's used, or not used. I didn't act immediately. I spent days verifying my understanding. I consulted external frameworks, quietly, hypothetically, without naming names. I made sure I wasn't misreading the situation, or projecting meaning where there was none. Each confirmation narrowed the ambiguity. What I had wasn't a weapon, it was an option. One that existed only because no one had bothered to notice where the real work had been happening. I also understood something else. If this option became necessary, it would mean the system had already failed. It wouldn't be a victory. It would be a response. That clarity changed how I felt about everything that had come before. The silence. The dismissal. The role I'd been assigned. None of it felt personal anymore. It felt structural. And structures don't have intentions. They have consequences. I thought about my mother, about the pressure she carried, about the confidence she projected because she believed she had to. I thought about how shocked she would be if she knew how close the system was to relying on someone she considered peripheral. And I felt no desire to prove anything to her. What mattered was readiness. So I documented the path clearly. What conditions would require action? What steps would need to be taken? What outcomes were possible, and which ones were not? I stripped the situation of emotion until only responsibility remained. When I closed my notebook that night, I didn't feel resolved. I felt prepared. There's a difference. Resolution seeks an ending. Preparation accepts uncertainty. I went home, slept normally, and returned the next day to do my job as I always had. No one noticed anything different. Why would they? From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, the story had shifted, not toward confrontation, toward inevitability. Because once you see the truth of a system, you can't unsee it. And once you know where responsibility truly lies, you don't get to pretend it belongs to someone else. I didn't know when the moment would come. I only knew that when it did, I would be ready to choose. The decision point didn't announce itself. There was no crisis meeting, no sudden collapse that forced immediate action. Instead, it arrived gradually, like a weather front you can sense long before it reaches you. Pressure had been building for months, margins tightening, external partners are asking sharper questions. Internal processes are stretching thinner with each new commitment. The business was still functioning, but only just, and mostly because people were working harder to compensate for decisions that hadn't been fully thought through. I could see several paths forward. None of them was comfortable. The first option was to return to my old pattern. Step in early. Correct quietly. Absorb friction. Preserve the illusion that everything was under control. That path required no confrontation, no explanation. It would keep relationships smooth and my position unchanged. But it came with a cost I could no longer ignore. It meant reinforcing a system that depended on invisibility. It meant accepting responsibility without authority indefinitely. And it meant that when things eventually failed, as they inevitably would, the failure would still land at my feet, just without my name attached. The second option was to speak up, to present my findings, outline the risks, and demand a seat at the table. On paper, this looked reasonable, transparent, mature. In practice, I knew how it would be received. I had watched similar attempts play out before. Quiet concerns are reframed as overthinking. Structural issues are dismissed as negativity. Warnings acknowledged politely and then ignored. Speaking up would change how I was seen, but not necessarily how decisions were made. And once you speak, you lose the advantage of being underestimated. The third option was the one I hadn't wanted to name. To act within the bounds of my responsibility, not beyond them. To use the position I had been given, not the one I was denied. To stabilize the situation in a way that couldn't be undone casually. Not to take control, not to embarrass anyone, but to ensure continuity when continuity was at risk. This option was irreversible. Once exercised, it would expose how much the system relied on invisible labor. It would force acknowledgement, not through words, but through consequence. I didn't rush the decision. I waited for clarity. It came in the form of a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Two senior leaders discussing contingency plans, plans that assumed I would handle the details while they managed optics. No malice, just an assumption. That was the moment I understood something fully. They weren't choosing to exclude me. They didn't even see me as a factor. And as long as that remained true, nothing structural would change. I went back to my desk and opened my notebook. I reviewed the conditions I had outlined weeks earlier. The threshold had been crossed, not dramatically, but definitively. I acted. The steps themselves were procedural, boring even. Notifications sent, safeguards triggered. Agreements were reviewed under clauses that had always existed but never been used. Authority exercised exactly as delegated, no more and no less. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't ask permission. I wasn't required to seek. I followed the process. That was the irreversible part. Because once process replaces assumption, things don't snap back into place. They settle differently. Within days, the effects began to surface. Delays that couldn't be smoothed over informally. Decisions that required signatures from people who hadn't been paying attention. Conversations that suddenly needed substance, not confidence. No one blamed me. They didn't know how to. From their perspective, the system had simply become more demanding. And I stayed calm, present, available. I hadn't chosen confrontation. I had chosen responsibility. There's a quiet weight that comes with making a decision no one else realizes you've made. You don't get applause. You don't get validation. You just get consequences. And once they begin, there's no turning back. After the decision, life didn't suddenly feel heavier. If anything, it felt clearer. The noise that used to accompany every choice, doubt, justification, second-guessing, fell away. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was executing. I moved carefully, but not cautiously. There's a difference. Caution hesitates. Carefulness follows the process. Every action I took was within my remit, documented, and aligned with existing policy. That mattered. Not because I feared being questioned, but because clarity would be essential when questions eventually came. I formalized procedures that had previously lived in conversations and memory. I rerouted approvals through channels that already existed on paper but were rarely used in practice. I ensured that key dependencies were visible, not just assumed. None of this looked dramatic. In fact, it looked like good governance, which is why it went unnoticed. People are accustomed to chaos being loud. They don't expect order to be disruptive. As these changes took hold, the pace of work slowed slightly. Not because anyone was working less, but because shortcuts were no longer available. Decisions required justification. Timelines had to be realistic. Risk had to be acknowledged rather than deferred. From the outside, it appeared as if the business was becoming more complex. Internally, it was becoming more honest. My mother noticed the friction before she noticed me. She commented on how everything seems to take longer lately, on how partners were asking more questions, on how simple matters were suddenly tied up in the process. I listened. I agreed where appropriate. I didn't explain. Not yet, because explanations are only useful when someone is ready to hear them. And she wasn't asking why. She was reacting to the inconvenience. Others responded differently. Some adapted quickly, appreciating the clarity. Long-term staff especially seemed relieved. They had been carrying uncertainty quietly for years. Structure gave them something to lean on. Others struggled. They were used to decisions being validated by confidence rather than documentation. For them, the new normal felt restrictive. I didn't argue with them. I pointed them to the process. I didn't attach my name to these changes. There was no need. The system didn't require authorship, only adherence. That anonymity protected me. It allowed people to engage with the reality of the situation rather than with me as a symbol. No one felt challenged personally. They felt challenged structurally, and structure always wins in the long run. As weeks passed, the consequences compounded. Not catastrophically, but unmistakably. Financial forecasts had to be revised. Commitments were renegotiated. Assumptions were questioned. Still, no one connected these shifts to me. Why would they? I was still the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who helped out. That misperception gave me space to continue. I was careful not to overreach. Every action had a rationale. Every step could be traced. I wasn't tightening control. I was restoring alignment. At night, I slept well. That surprised me. I had expected anxiety, guilt, maybe even fear. Instead, there was a sense of alignment I hadn't felt in years. My actions matched my understanding. My silence matched my intention. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting, because I knew that systems resist change until they can no longer ignore it. And when that moment comes, people look for someone to explain what's happening. When they did, I would be there. Not to say I told you so, not to demand recognition, but to take responsibility, fully, visibly, and without heat. The first real sign that things were changing didn't come as an accusation. It came as confusion. People started asking the same questions more than once, not because they hadn't been answered, but because the answers no longer resolved the underlying tension. Timelines were questioned, costs were revisited, assumptions that had carried weight for years suddenly needed explanation. At first, everyone treated it as temporary, a rough patch, a phase of adjustment. There was confidence that things would settle back down once the pressure eased. But pressure wasn't the problem anymore. Exposure was. Without informal corrections happening behind the scenes, weaknesses stayed visible longer. Meetings ended without clear conclusions. Decisions that once relied on momentum stalled under scrutiny. People felt the drag but couldn't identify its source. That's when discomfort turned into loss. Not a dramatic loss, no layoffs, no collapse, just the loss of ease. Deals took longer to close. Partners hesitated. Internal teams grew frustrated by the need to document what they had previously assumed. It felt like friction where there had once been flow. My mother felt it acutely. She prided herself on decisiveness, on moving quickly when others hesitated. Now, speed was being checked by the process. She found herself waiting for confirmations that had never been required before, being asked for details she hadn't needed to provide in the past. I saw the irritation build, but I also saw something else: uncertainty. She began asking more questions, not in meetings, but afterward, quietly, tentatively. Questions about why certain approvals were required now. Why were certain partners pushing back? Why things that used to be simple were suddenly complicated? I answered factually, calmly, without framing. The contract requires it. That responsibility was never formally assigned. This risk was always there. Each answer was true, and each one landed heavier than the last. Others felt the shift differently. Some grew defensive. They searched for someone to blame: process, market conditions, external pressure. A few began to reminisce about how smoothly things used to run, without realizing what had been making that smoothness possible. No one mentioned my name. That was the strangest part. Even as the consequences of my absence from informal correction became obvious, my presence as a stabilizing force remained assumed. People still came to me with questions, still relied on me to explain what was happening, still treated me as support. But now, support wasn't enough. The system demanded decisions that required authority, not just effort, and authority had to be visible. The discomfort intensified. Small delays cascaded into larger ones. Confidence wavered, not publicly, but in tone. Conversations that used to be assertive became cautious. That's when panic began to surface, not loud, but tight. Meetings were called to streamline processes. Consultants were discussed. External fixes were considered. All of them addressed symptoms, not the cause. I watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. Because this wasn't a failure of people. It was a failure of structure. And structure can't be fixed by urgency alone. The hardest moment for me came when someone said, almost offhandedly, "We need someone who really understands how things work around here." They were talking about me. They didn't realize it. And that was the point. They were feeling the loss of something they had never acknowledged, the cost of assuming stability without understanding its source. I knew then that the window for denial was closing. Confusion was giving way to realization, and realization, when delayed too long, tends to arrive as regret. But we weren't there yet. Not quite. By the time everyone understood that something fundamental had changed, the idea of fixing it had already become abstract. Not because solutions didn't exist, but because the conditions that made easy fixes possible were gone. Panic doesn't arrive loudly at first. It tightens. Conversations shorten. People stop finishing sentences because they're no longer sure what's safe to say. Meetings multiply, but clarity doesn't. I saw it most clearly in my mother. She began staying later at the office, reviewing documents she had once skimmed, asking for summaries of things she used to approve instinctively. The confidence that had once driven her decisions was still there, but it was now paired with hesitation. She asked me to walk her through a few processes, casually at first. "Just remind me how this works. Help me understand why this takes longer now," I explained patiently. I showed her the documentation, the approvals, the dependencies. I didn't editorialize. I didn't say, "This is what happens when..." I let the structure speak. That's when she realized the truth that's hardest for leaders to face. The system had been working because someone had been compensating for it, not because it was sound. Her frustration shifted direction. It turned inward. She started asking whether we could go back to how things were, whether some steps could be skipped just this once, whether relationships could smooth things over. In other words, whether invisibility could be restored. But invisibility, once broken, doesn't come back easily. The partners had adapted. They had adjusted expectations. They had seen the real boundaries. Employees, too, had recalibrated. They now understood where authority actually sat and where it didn't. Trying to reverse that would require effort, explanation, and trust that no longer existed in the same form. I could see the moment it fully registered for her. We were sitting across from each other in her office, papers spread out between us. Silence stretches longer than usual. She looked up at me and asked quietly, "When did all of this start?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a question weighted with realization. I answered honestly, "It's been like this for a while. We just didn't see it." That was the closest I came to naming my role. She leaned back, eyes unfocused. I could almost hear the recalculations happening, replaying conversations, reframing memories, searching for the moment where a different choice might have changed things. That moment didn't exist, because the issue wasn't a single decision. It was a pattern. The panic spread outward. Senior leaders began questioning their assumptions. Some tried to reassert control through authority. Others deferred, unsure. The lack of alignment became visible to everyone. And still, no one blamed me. They couldn't. Everything that had changed had followed existing rules. No boundaries had been crossed, no shortcuts taken, only assumptions removed. That's when regret entered the room. Not dramatic regret, not apologies or confessions, just a heavy awareness that something had been missed for too long, and that recognizing it now didn't restore what had been lost. My mother didn't say the word useless again. She didn't need to. The silence around that word said enough. What people don't tell you about moments like this is that they're deeply lonely. Not for the person who's losing control, but for the one who finally holds it responsibly. Because by the time the system acknowledges you, it's no longer possible to pretend you're invisible. And by the time people want things to go back, you've already moved forward. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like a confrontation at all. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic pauses waiting for someone to break. It was quiet, deliberate, almost careful. My mother asked me to stay after a meeting one evening. The office had emptied out, the way it often did lately, people leaving with more questions than answers. She closed the door and sat across from me, her posture more guarded than I'd ever seen it. She didn't start by apologizing. She didn't start by defending herself either. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with hours worked. "I need to understand something," she said. "When did you realize how much you were carrying?" The question mattered more than any apology could have. It acknowledged what had never been named. I thought about answering with a date, with a story, with the words she had used that night months ago. But none of that would have been useful. "A long time ago," I said. "I just didn't think it mattered." She nodded slowly, not in agreement, in recognition. There was a pause. Then she asked the harder question, "Why didn't you tell me?" This time I didn't soften the answer. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything," I said. "Not then." She looked down at the papers on her desk. I could see her processing the weight of that, not as an accusation, but as a truth she had to accept. She asked whether I had planned all of this, whether I had been waiting for things to break. "No," I said. "I was waiting to see if they would be noticed." That distinction landed. I explained my actions factually, the steps I had taken, the reasons behind them, the boundaries I had respected. I didn't frame them as corrective. I framed them as necessary. She didn't interrupt. She didn't challenge details. She asked clarifying questions, short ones, precise, not defensive, curious. At one point, she stopped me. "You could have used this to force your way in," she said. "You didn't." I nodded. That wasn't the point. The room was quiet again. Not tense, just full. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I misjudged you," she said. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't explain herself. And I didn't ask for more. Because what mattered wasn't the acknowledgement, it was the recalibration. She asked what I wanted now. The old version of me might have deflected, might have said it didn't matter, that I was fine where I was. I didn't do that. "I want clarity," I said, "about responsibility, about authority, about expectations." She nodded again. This time there was resolve in it. The conversation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. No grand plan was drawn up, no future titles assigned, but something essential had shifted. For the first time, we were speaking as two people who understood the same system, even if we had arrived there from different directions. As I left her office that night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter. Not because I had been validated, but because I no longer had to carry the truth alone. I didn't become a different person after that conversation. That's important to say. There was no transformation montage, no sudden confidence that changed how I spoke or moved through rooms. What changed was simpler and more permanent. I stopped shrinking, not in defiance, not to make a point, just in alignment with what was already true. My role in the business evolved, but not overnight. Authority was clarified gradually, in writing, through the process. Decisions that once bypassed me now included me by default, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. My mother adjusted, not by stepping back entirely, but by stepping with me. Our relationship became quieter, more respectful, less performative. We didn't revisit the past often. There was no need. The word she had used, the one that started all of this, was never spoken again. Not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer fit. I learned something during that period that changed how I see myself. Being underestimated doesn't mean you lack strength. Sometimes it means your strength hasn't been translated into a language others recognize yet. I didn't suddenly start seeking recognition. I still prefer working behind the scenes. I still listen more than I speak. But now, when I speak, it carries weight, not because I demand it, but because it's grounded in responsibility. The biggest change was internal. I no longer measured my value by how much I could endure without complaint. I measured it by how well my actions aligned with my principles. Silence was no longer my shield. It was one of many tools. Outside the business, this shift echoed quietly. In conversations with friends, in how I set boundaries, in how I responded when people made assumptions about me. I didn't correct them immediately. I didn't feel the need to. I knew now that clarity arrives when it's required, not when it's requested. My mother and I are not close in a sentimental way. We don't talk about feelings anymore. But there is a steadiness between us that didn't exist before. A mutual understanding of capacity. She sees me now, not as someone who helps out, but as someone who holds things together and knows when to let them change. As for me, I no longer need to be invisible to feel safe. I don't need to be loud to feel strong. I understand my pace, my limits, and my leverage. That understanding is enough. If there's one thing I would tell my younger self, it's this. Endurance is not the same as loyalty, and silence is not the same as absence. You can be present without being seen, until the moment being seen becomes necessary. And when that moment comes, you don't need to announce yourself. You just need to be ready. When people hear this story summarized, they often focus on the contrast. Called useless, saved the business. It sounds clean that way, satisfying, like a reversal with a clear winner and a clear lesson. But real life rarely resolves so neatly. What actually stayed with me wasn't the moment my value was finally recognized. It was the understanding that recognition was never the point. What mattered was responsibility, who quietly carries it, who assumes it will always be there, and what happens when it's no longer invisible. My mother didn't become a villain in this story. She also didn't become a symbol of redemption. She remained human, capable, pressured, and imperfect. The same is true of everyone involved. Systems fail not because people are cruel, but because assumptions go unexamined for too long. For a long time, I believed that staying quiet was a form of maturity, that absorbing friction was a strength, that if I just kept things running smoothly, clarity would arrive on its own. It doesn't. Clarity requires structure, boundaries, alignment between responsibility and authority, and sometimes it requires letting discomfort surface long enough for people to see what's really holding things together. The moral here isn't prove them wrong. It isn't wait for your moment, and it certainly isn't revenge. The moral is quieter than that. If you are always compensating for a system, you are part of that system, whether you're acknowledged or not. And if you want something to change, endurance alone will never be enough. Silence can protect you, but only intention can reposition you. I didn't win anything by being underestimated, but I gained something by finally understanding the leverage that invisibility creates and the responsibility that comes with using it carefully. Today, I'm still calm, still reflective, still, some people might overlook at first glance. The difference is that I no longer confuse being overlooked with being without value, and I no longer wait for permission to act responsibly. If you've ever been the one everyone relies on but no one really sees, if you've ever been trusted with the weight but denied the voice, if you've ever been labeled small because you didn't announce your strength, then maybe this story wasn't about me at all. Maybe it was about what happens when quiet people stop trying to be heard. and start choosing when to be understood. So I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that the moment people finally noticed your value was also the moment they understood how much they'd been relying on you all along?
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới.